Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day number 3 of the DCA and Huawei 5G training sessions. Again, from our side, it's a privilege to be able to share with you today from our experts across the globe, so to speak. For today, we've got international representation from Cesar Guterres, who is currently in the position of wireless regulatory policy for Africa and the Middle East. And with that being said, I've got immense respect and admiration for Cesar. He brings a wealth of experience from the industry, and I'm going to hand over the session to him today. Just quickly, would like to share my screen with you and show you where we are in the progress for this week. So this is session number 3. And tomorrow and Friday, we've got more sessions available. So I would like you to please join us if possible for the other sessions as well for the rest of the week. Just some logistics in terms of the Q&A that we ask you to please hold on to your questions. You're welcome to post them in the Q&A portion of the webinar, and then after the Cesar has finished his presentation, we will allow then opportunity to address all of the questions. As I've mentioned yesterday, there was yesterday a lot of interest and questions specifically relating to spectrum and the application of spectrum, the importance of spectrum when it comes to 5G. So with today's session, I believe all of your questions would be answered, and that everything would be would make more sense to you in terms of this very, very important aspect of spectrum when it comes to 5G and its technologies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cesar. Enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Marius, and good morning to everybody. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak to you about this important subject for 5G, which is spectrum. So as Marius has said, I lead in Huawei for spectrum regulatory issues in Africa. And I think that some of you very likely have already met. We have already met. As you probably know, I'm active in ATU and active in ITU, and I come regularly. I used to come regularly to South Africa before the COVID crisis started. So the session for today is about spectrum for 5G. I do have a number of slides that I will use to support this session, and let me see. I will start sharing my screen, and Marius, perhaps confirm that you can see my screen. Don't mind.
Yes, we can see your screen. That's it.
Okay. Very good. So next, I'm going to stop my video in case there are any issues with connectivity. Okay, so 5G spectrum. What I would like to do for the session today is start with a very brief update on where we are with 5G globally. I think my colleagues have touched on this yesterday or the day before, but I'll give you just a very brief update, and then we will get into the topic of spectrum for 5G. Okay, so let's start with the global picture. And so this is information from a couple of months ago. There are, I will highlight that you have a number of figures here on this screen, but I will highlight a couple of things. First, that there are about a bit more than 160 operators providing 5G services globally. So this is a relatively high number, given that it was not long ago that 5G was introduced for the first time. So about 160 operators globally. And the second thing I would highlight is that many of these operators are providing fixed wireless access services in addition to mobile services, or in some cases just exclusively 5G fixed wireless access services. So the 5G networks, one of the key use cases of the 5G networks, at least at these early stages of introduction, is actually a fixed wireless broadband, and we will touch on this during the presentation. But the reason for that is that first, that there is a very big market globally for households that do not have broadband, fixed broadband, but they do have the financial means of affording that service. So in most of the cases where people do not have broadband at home, the reason is not because they cannot pay for it; it is because it's not available by their the local fixed operators. So that's a space that mobile operators have been quite interested in jumping into. And as you can see from this map, it's not just 5G networks; it's also LTE networks. But in most of the countries, most of the countries in the world, we do see fixed broadband services being provided through mobile networks. So this was the case. Most of these countries here are using LTE, and some of them are using 5G. But this is a trend that we are certainly seeing an increase with the introduction of 5G, because 5G does allow for much higher capacity, and that allows to provide services to the households that can be comparable to fiber or to coaxial cable in terms of speeds. So as I said, perhaps the thing to underline here is the importance of a fixed wireless access and providing connectivity to households using the mobile networks. As I said, this is clearly a use case that is becoming very, very popular. Okay, so let's now get into a spectrum, and these are basically the topics that I would like to cover in the rest of the session. So we will start with a look at the different frequency ranges that we think would be needed for 5G services. Then we will look at what has become the key band for the first wave of deployments, which is the C band, and the need for large blocks for each operator, so that they can provide the speeds and at a cost that is efficient for the business, basically. Then we will look at more policy-related aspects, like spectrum prices, spectrum fees, and then coverage obligations on other kind of obligations. We will try to show you some examples of things that have been done in other countries, and of policies that have been put in place in other countries to facilitate the deployment of 5G. And then we will finish with a look at the future in terms of what we think would be needed in terms of additional spectrum in the future for 5G, and then in the long term for 6G. So these topics, our views and recommendations on these topics are captured in the documents that I show on the left here on the screen. We do have a 5G spectrum policy position in Huawei, but as you know, the GSMA also has a number of documents, and they have, in particular, they do have a policy position paper. And then there are also papers from the GSA, which is the Association of Vendors, which these documents also outline the views of the vendors. In general, we are pretty much aligned with each other and with what I'm going to tell you today. Okay, well, let's start with the first topic, and let's start first perhaps with a look at what do we mean when we talk about 5G. So this is a chart that surely you have seen before. It comes from the ITU recommendation that defines IMT 2020. And what this is doing is comparing the capabilities of IMT 2020 with the capabilities of IMT Advanced. So for us, when we talk about 5G, we talk about IMT 2020, and IMT Advanced is basically LTE and LTE Advanced. So when looking at these targets that the ITU established a few years ago when they specified IMT 2020. So in our view, in particular, when we approach this from the perspective of spectrum, the key targets are those that are highlighted. In particular, the user experience data rate, which for IMT 2020 should be at least 100 megabits per second. So this is, in our view, the measure that best would identify 5G as from the perspective of the user. So it is certainly good to have very high peak data rates, like 20 gigabits per second, and all the other metrics. But what would make a difference for the user and the perception that the user has of the service would be whether the services can provide in a continuous way, in a ubiquitous way, this 100 megabits per second. That is what would, from the user perspective, we think that is what makes the difference. So that is for us the key target that we should try to meet. So having said all this, now let's look at the bands. So our view is that we need a spectrum in what we call the high bands, mid bands, and the low bands for 5G. So the definition of what these frequency ranges mean specifically changes and depends on which people or organization are you talking to. But generally speaking, when we talk about high bands, we mean the millimeter wave bands, the microwave bands that were identified for 5G at the last World Radio Conference 2019. So in particular, we're talking about the 26 gigahertz band. When we talk about mid bands, we talk about the bands in the range from, let's say, 2 gigahertz up to 6 gigahertz. And when we talk about the low bands, we talk about the bands below that. And we talk about the traditional mobile bands. So a spectrum in these three ranges will be necessary for 5G. And the key one, at least from considering this from the early deployments and from the beginning of the deployment of the technology, the key range is the mid bands. So and it is the key range for two reasons. It provides with a good coverage, in particular in urban and suburban areas, and it provides sufficient capacity to achieve the targets that I mentioned earlier of 100 megabits per second. So it's a range that it has good coverage characteristics and good capacity. The millimeter wave bands, they afford a very high capacity, but they are constrained when it comes to coverage. So we see these millimeter wave bands as appropriate for hotspots. They are not appropriate in our view to provide ubiquitous coverage, not even in cities, because that would require a very high number of stations to be deployed. At the other end, the low bands, they provide much better coverage. They provide deep indoor coverage, which is an important capability for certain use cases, such as IoT, for instance, reading of meters that are in the basement, for instance. So the low bands are, we see them used in fundamentally to provide coverage to rural areas. They will certainly also be used in urban areas, but they become important for rural areas. And we're talking here, as I said, about the bands that are already mobile bands. So a spectrum in the three ranges would be needed eventually. The mid bands as the sort of the key anchor set of bands, in particular in urban and suburban areas. The low bands for providing this rural coverage and indoor coverage, and then the high bands for hotspots. We can think of a shopping center or a stadium, a sports venue, where there is a very high number of people that would demand a lot of capacity. In those cases, we think there would be deployments of millimeter wave bands. And in addition to all this, I think there is also the aspect of fixed wireless access, and we do see both the mid bands and the high bands being used for fixed wireless access. Because they do have the capacity, and we can, in the case of the millimeter wave bands, we can achieve a reasonable coverage for this type of application. Okay, so this is let's say the full picture. Now let's get into the mid bands. I would say I'd like to say a few words about the mid bands, because we think that they are very important, and they are the key. The milestone, the key set of bands for successful deployment. So just to start with a couple of figures. First, to say that as you can see from the left, the majority of the networks that have been deployed, the 5G networks that have been deployed up to now, has been in this frequency range, in particular in the C-band, but more in the C-band and the 2.6 and 2.3 bands. So that's the majority of the network so far. And also when we look at the supporting handsets, we also see that the mid bands, in particular, again the C-band, is the most popular bands in handsets. So about the C-band in particular, so this is a band that is very important, and that is also important for other services like the fixed satellite service. And it's a band that is being globally used for 5G, but it's also a band that traditionally and globally has been used for fixed satellite services. So what I showed you here on the left is how this band is being used in different regions or different countries. So different regions have taken different views on the balance between the two services, between satellite service and mobile service. So you can see, for instance, that as of today in Africa, in the Africa region, we do have the lower part of the band, 3.4 to 3.6, identified for mobile use, and in many countries actually is being used for fixed broadband wireless, fixed broadband access. Fixed wireless access. My apologies. And progressively, some countries are like South Africa are on their way to introduce 5G in this band. In Europe, the split goes up to the mobile allocation goes up to 3.8. Same thing in the Arab world. In the US, you probably know that very recently they concluded the auction of the 3.7 up to 4.2 block for mobile, which it was a block that had been used for fixed satellite services. China get different arrangement up to 3.6. Japan goes higher. So different countries, different regions, they have different views on this. And it's a question, in our view, it's a question of for the countries and the regions of evaluating which is the service that provides better value, and trying to find their own position on what is the best balance between the services. So now On the right, what I show you is perhaps a bit more detail in the way the 5G networks have been deployed up to now. So this is a chart that comes from the GSA, which shows you the detail of in terms of which bands have been used for the deployment, or even for the licenses, even if there hasn't been a deployment yet, or for the trials. And as you can see, the band that comes on top is the C band. So this chart uses the 3GPP terminology. So you see there N77, N78. That is the 3GPP. Those are the 3GPP bands for band identifications for this frequency block, for 3.4 up to 4.2. Actually, 3.3 up to 4.2. So what you can see, it's really the most popular band. Right. Okay. So let me just comment on actual, on theoretical and actual deployments. So on the left, I show you here a trial that we did, Huawei did in China a couple of years ago now. Where we deployed a few base stations in this band, in the C band, using a block of 100 megahertz and using massive MIMO. So these are antennas, these are massive MIMO or advanced antenna systems. These are antennas that basically are formed by a high number of smaller dipole antennas. So and they have multiple transmitters and receivers. So the case that we used in this trial was antennas with 64 transmitters, 64 transmitters and receivers, and I think probably was about 250 individual antennas, something like that. So this is a trial that we did with along with a car moving along a number of roads, and what you can see from here is that with this configuration, the speeds that were achieved were higher than 1 gigabit per second. So this, of course, is a trial where there was only one terminal using the network, but it gives you an idea of what can be achieved in terms of peak capacity with a real network, because these were real base stations, commercial base stations, and they were deployed in an urban area. But again, as I say, this was just one user. And then on the right, what I try to show you here is what's a typical, what we expect to be a typical deployment in this band. So we expect and we recommend to have blocks that are 80 or 100 megahertz. And we do also if recommend to use massive MIMO antennas. And with these two key parameters, what is normally achieved is our speeds of 50 or to 100 megabits anywhere and in the cell. So this would be what a normal user would be able to receive or to achieve in terms of downlink throughput, again per user in a real life deployment in an urban area, and this is what we are seeing. So on average, this would mean about 5 gigabits of capacity per cell, and perhaps the thing that is more important from the perspective of the mobile operator is the cost reduction. So compared with LTE in a similar deployment. So basically what we're saying here is that 5G would reuse the existing LTE cells. So comparing with this deployment versus an LTE deployment, the cost per bit would be 10 times less. Okay. So a couple of words about IMT coexistence between IMT services and fixed satellite services. So this is a topic that is quite important because this is a band, as I said, it's a band that is traditionally a satellite band, and it is now the block 36 to 38 is now under consideration. Well, it will be considered at the next World Radio Conference for what we call a primary mobile allocation. So currently it is secondary. I'm talking about region 1, ITU region 1, which includes Africa. So currently it's the block 36238 has got a primary fixed satellite service allocation and a secondary mobile allocation. And what will be considered at WC23 is to upgrade the mobile allocation and make it primary as well. So it's a topic that is being studied in ITU, and I guess it's fair to say it's a hot topic in ITU in Africa, and it will be quite discussed at the WRC in 2023. So this what you have now on the screen tries to summarize with what, in a very schematic way, what we think our thinking on this on the coexistence issue. So we think we can separate quite 4 scenarios, depending on whether the fixed satellite services, the VSATs, are deployed in rural areas or urban areas, and whether the VSATs are ubiquitous and at unknown locations, or alternatively there are just a few Earth stations and they are at known locations. So we think that in the simplest of the cases, where you have very few Earth stations and deployed in rural areas, the coexistence is feasible. You can identify restriction areas around the Earth stations where mobile services would not be able to be deployed. The same situation with a few Earth stations but in urban areas. The starting approach would be to do the same thing, to consider the exclusion zones or restriction zones. But then here it's important that the authorities look at the cost, well, I would say cost-benefit analysis, and consider whether it is more valuable to maintain those few Earth stations in urban areas, or alternatively to move them elsewhere or to different frequencies and deploy 5G in the cities. On the other hand, if the Earth stations are ubiquitous, I can think of perhaps stations that could be used by households, so there would be a very high number. Then we think that if that is the deployments, the Earth station deployments again are in rural areas and not that much in urban areas, it could be possible to set up basically to divide the country into zones. One is the rural areas where the satellite service would continue, and another would be the urban areas where 5G would be allowed. And then it would be possible to set up a buffer zone to protect the buffer zone where there is no 5G deployments, and basically protects the VSATs in the rural areas. And finally, and to conclude, if you have the worst case scenario, I would say, where you have ubiquitous Earth stations and they are located in urban areas, then that is a case that is very difficult to address. And then the authorities would have to consider again whether 5G would bring more value to those urban areas compared to the satellite use. So to summarize on this, I think the key aspects here are whether the Earth stations are ubiquitous. So that, I think, is a very important question, and we were very keen on understanding a bit more about the deployments of Earth stations. So everybody, authorities, the mobile industry, and I think the satellite industry as well, we should try to work on this, having the best possible information. So it would be very good to understand the deployments of VSATs. So that in our view is a very important aspect here. And the second question is one for the authorities, whether they think that 5G is something that provides higher value in this band, or they think that satellite services should be maintained. So that's a question for, as I said, for the regulators, for the authorities to decide on what is the best use of the band. Now, let's move on. So just a quick word about the bands below, I say here below 3 gigahertz, but this is about basically about the existing bands, the existing mobile bands. And just to point out that in some countries we are already seeing interest from operators to deploy 5G in the traditional mobile bands, in particular certainly the 700 megahertz, the second digital dividend, but also in traditional 4G and 3G bands like 2.1 and 1.8. So I think that the rationale here is quite clear from the perspective of the operators. They do have licenses in these bands, and they are perhaps their networks are arriving. The network equipment is arriving at the end of the life, and they have to renew the equipment. So as part of that, they come to us and they start thinking about whether they can deploy equipment that supports 5G and 4G and possibly 3G, but certainly equipment that, in addition to LTE, does support 5G in these bands. And we are seeing this in Europe, in a number of countries in Europe. And we think that it's a question of the normal renewal of the network by operators as they think about installing new software, new hardware, because as I said, it arrives to the end of the amortization period, or it starts becoming obsolete. They think about what is in the market in terms of what vendors provide, and they start thinking about introducing 5G very much in the same way as perhaps 5 years ago LTE was introduced in the 1800 band, which was a 2G band. So this is a trend that we are beginning to see in some specific countries, but we suspect it will also increase in the future. Okay, so let's move to a slightly different angle of the spectrum discussion, which is how much spectrum does an operator need to provide 5G services. So I'm sure that some of you had heard this before. Our recommendation is each operator should get at least 80 or 100 megahertz in a contiguous block. And we're talking here about the mid bands, so the C band and perhaps other bands, but fundamentally the C band. So this is a recommendation. I underline and emphasize this. It's a recommendation, and it's a recommendation that it doesn't only come from us. It's something that you will hear from the GSMA as well. You will hear from the other vendors, certainly, but you will also hear from the regulators, in particular in Europe, and the policymakers like the European Commission. So there they do have CPT recommendations with documents with this recommendation, and there are the European Commission decisions with this recommendation. And perhaps certainly more relevant for the case of South Africa, ATU has finished the work on a recommendation for emerging technologies, which covers 5G, and we finished that work in, I think it was a couple of months ago. So that this recommendation of large contiguous blocks is also captured in that ATU document. So the reasons are outlined on the right. I think the starting point is the demands from the users. If we're thinking of a demand of 100 megabits per second, and you want to provide that a number of users in your cell, you do need capacity, and you need a large block, there is you certainly would deploy technologies like massive MIMO, but you do need to have a large bandwidth to support that. This large bandwidth is actually something that 5G was designed for in 3GPP, so it does support this size of channels. It certainly supports the smaller channels, but the preliminary, the first and the first target from 3GPP was to support large channels of this size, for instance. It is certainly more efficient in terms of use of the spectrum, and perhaps from the operator's perspective, it does lower the cost of deployment significantly. So those are the reasons why, at a high level, why we think this is an important target that regulators and authorities should try to achieve. So in this slide, I get elaborate a bit more on some of the more technical aspects of this. It shows you some analysis that we and the GSMA and consultants have done on this question of how much spectrum should each operator have in the C-band or in the mid-bands. From the perspective of deployment, as you can see here, the GSMA did a study, and if you wanted to provide coverage to a given area with say 100 megabits per second, and you had different channel sizes, different blocks, the GSMA found that you would need that you would need 60% more cells if you used 60 megahertz compared to 100 megahertz. In terms of cost per bit, there is a study from the consultants called Colleago that looks at how the cost for the operator goes down when you increase the channel size. On the right, on top, you can see perhaps something that is relatively easy to understand, is that if you get a situation in a country where you're thinking of releasing 2 bands for 5G services, and you say, for instance, you will have 3 operators, it is much more efficient to allocate those bands in a way where each operator only has a spectrum in one of the bands, instead of having small blocks for each of the 3 operators in the 2 bands. So the first scenario allows simply it's going to be way more cost effective, because the operators would only need to deploy 1 module, whereas in the second case they will have to deploy radio modules that operate in both bands, and in addition to that, the operational cost would be higher, because they would have to manage 2 different bands from the same sites, which certainly is certainly something that can be done, but again, increases complexity and increases cost. And then in terms of efficiency, you have it at the bottom. You lose capacity from the moment and this is a comparison of having 100 megahertz in one single block versus 100 megahertz in 2 50 megahertz blocks. And simply just because of having to have two blocks operating at the same time, that would mean that you lose capacity because of the overheads and because of the need to have some guard bands. So again, it's less efficient. So there are many reasons why we think it's important to have large contiguous blocks. Having said all this, we recognize that it's not always possible. In some cases, countries do not have enough spectrum for the number of operators. So you can think of a scenario where there is only 200 megahertz available, but there are 4 operators in the country. So in that case, clearly you would not be able to give each of them a large block. But in as much as possible, we do certainly recommend to target large blocks if we want to really exploit 5G in the best way. Okay, so let's change subject again. And let me just bring here some examples about obligations. So we think that obligations can be a useful tool, provided that they are designed with care, and provided that they are not too onerous for operators, because if that is the case, it is likely that things will backfire. It's likely that operators would step back and even do not apply for the spectrum. So we see that, and I'll go through these examples now. We see that many countries globally are introducing obligations of one kind or another when they have released 5G spectrum. But again, I have to emphasize and very strongly that this has to be done with care. It has to be done with consultation with the operators, and these obligations need to be proportional, and they need to be considerate. So some of the examples from countries in other regions. So from Korea, the obligation came in the form of a number of sites to be deployed over a number of years. In Japan, the obligation came in the form of population, so having to provide coverage to a percentage of the population after a number of years, and also in the form of a network investment. In Italy, similar obligation in terms of population. Looking at, you see there, a percentage of towns with small towns. So the target here in Italy was for providing coverage to small towns, so small villages. Because of course the assumption here by the Italian government is that the operators would normally deploy in the big cities and the big urban areas, and there was a risk that small towns would not get coverage. So they designed the obligation to achieve that, and then the obligation is for small towns. Germany is also an interesting case because it put in place quite a number of different obligations. It's an obligation for population, but there's also an obligation to provide coverage on roads. So here, the German government was very keen on having on supporting assisted driving. So they designed the 5G obligation for the 700 megahertz, so that a number of federal roads, so those are the national main roads, should be covered, and then the regional roads. They also require coverage on waterways, which are an important transportation means in Germany, in railways as well, and finally, along the railways lines. And then finally, there was also an obligation for what they call white spots, which are locations where there is no coverage, mobile coverage at all. So as you see, these countries, they had different kinds of obligations, and they are targeting slightly different policy goals. But I think I'm putting you here examples that have been successful in the sense that the operators did apply for the licenses, did obtain the licenses, and have been engaging in meeting the obligations. So these are, of course, these are countries that they do have a very so it's what I would say very highly developed countries, and countries that in any case have already had a very good mobile coverage. But I think the key thing here is a question of proportionality. So certainly each country will have to first consider the policy goals, and second consider a proportional obligation. Okay, so a different topic, and in a way is the the other side of the coin. So the spectrum prices. We recommend to be cautious with the spectrum prices. We do recommend to avoid very high prices. We recommend when the spectrum is auctioned, we recommend that reserve prices should be low, and we recommend that the auction should not be designed to raise money for the treasury. Should be designed to award the spectrum to the best user. Because we think that the price of mobile spectrum is becoming an issue, and certainly in some countries has become a problem. And high spectrum prices, we think they have a negative impact. They have a negative impact in deployment, in the amount of in the coverage that the operators are going to provide. They do have a negative impact on quality as well. Not so about consumer prices, it's not that clear. The figure you have on the left of here in the screen comes from the GSMA, from an econometric study that they did, and they did find that high prices caused poor coverage and network quality issues, but they didn't find that causality relation with consumer prices. So that's something that's up in there, but certainly it does have an impact on the expenditure from the operators on the network, whether it is for extending the coverage or for improving the coverage or improving the quality. It does have an impact. On the right, you can also see a analysis that was made by Coleago. They were looking at countries in Europe and in North America and Singapore, and they found that certainly the revenue that operators are extracting for each megahertz is going down. So what is happening is that the revenue per user is more or less stable or slightly decreasing, but you do need to provide more capacity to those users, and operators need to have more spectrum, so the actual revenue per megahertz is going down. So what it cannot be is that the cost per megahertz goes up, because these two trends together would make the business case unsustainable. So I think perhaps to recap on these last two topics, we think that our recommendation is that to authorities is to try to strike a balance where on one side reasonable obligations are required from the operators, and that as a balance, as the counter of that requirement, the prices for a spectrum are kept low. So we think that that is the best way to improve the to not improve, but to support and the deployment of 5G and to encourage operators to deploy 5G. First, you have the obligation, but then together with that, you reduce the costs that they pay for a spectrum. Okay, so another recommendation from our side when it comes to the spectrum fees is that we think that these fees should be staggered along the life of the license. So we recommend to avoid a big lump sum to be paid when the operator gets the spectrum. This is actually the typical way when there's an auction. In most cases, when there's an auction of a spectrum, the operator has to pay the total amount of the auction when it gets the license. We think that that is not very good, because precisely when the operator gets the license is when we would like that operator to make the deployments, and then therefore it's when the operator needs to have the financial means to do those deployments. So we think that hitting the operator with a big lump charge in the first year of the license goes against this objective of encouraging the operator to deploy. So we think that the spectrum fees should extend for the duration of the license, and even more, we recommend that perhaps the first year or the first 3 years there is an exemption of payments, so that the actual payment for the licenses would start at the 4th year or something like that. And this is something that some countries are already doing. For instance, the United Arab Emirates, China, Saudi Arabia, they have put in place this kind of free of charge period in the first few years. Other countries do have payments that extend through the life of the license, instead of charging the operator at the early beginning. So, for instance, Spain, Italy, Finland, they extend the payments over a number of years. Okay, so let me now give you some examples of policies that some countries have put in place to encourage 5G deployments. What I show you here is the examples of Saudi Arabia and Thailand, and they're actually quite similar in the policies that they have adopted. So the first thing is spectrum supply. So they have made available to operators a large amount of spectrum, and they have done that at a low price. In the case of Saudi Arabia, they do not run the spectrum was made available at a fraction of the price of the 4G licenses, and then they do extend the payments over a number of years. So all of this is to facilitate the life of the operators when it comes to making deployments. So first, provide abundant enough spectrum, and second, do not charge heavily for that spectrum. Same thing in Thailand. The price of the spectrum of the 5G spectrum has been much lower than the 4G spectrum, and there was a free period in the first few years. Another approach is actually financial, and in Saudi Arabia, what they have done is that they have linked the taxes that operators pay to the network improvement. So this is not about the spectrum. This is about the general taxes that the companies pay, and so they link that to the quality of the network. And another quite common approach is facilitate access to sites. So this is typically an issue that is a pain point for operators everywhere. It is difficult to obtain new sites. It's difficult to obtain the permission from the local authorities. It's difficult to get a new lease. It's difficult to get a good site where the owner is happy to install a mobile mast. All these things make the life of the operators difficult, and all these things mean that the coverage cannot increase as quickly as it could. So what countries are doing, in particular these two countries, are putting in place certain mechanisms to facilitate that. For instance, one thing that can be done in a relatively easy way is to facilitate access to public infrastructure, public buildings, or infrastructure such as lamp poles, traffic infrastructure, this kind of things. Okay, so another example is China, and I'll perhaps get into say a few more words about China, given that it's a market that we know well, and actually it's I would say that it's also a country where 5G take-up has been quite strong in terms of deployments and also in terms of subscribers. So actually, most of the 5G subscribers in the world are basically from China. So when it comes to the policies that the Chinese authorities have put in place, they are actually similar to what we've been talking about. There is no auction in China. The licenses are awarded administratively by the regulator, and the fees are not based in an auction. So they are set by the regulator. So one thing that they did is that the fees for 5G spectrum was much lower than for 4G. And second, as I mentioned, they put in place a free of charge period of 3 years. Another interesting feature of China is the support from cities. So cities such as Beijing, Shenzhen, or Chengdu, they have facilitated operators to deploy base stations. For instance, in Shenzhen, there's a subsidy for each 5G site that comes from the city council. Beijing, they also did something similar. They have a fund that is available to the operators to deploy in the city. So these are policies at the city level, not national policies. And also similarly, like as before, they have put in place mechanism to facilitate the getting new sites. So in the case of Beijing, they're providing access to operators to the public buildings and access to lamp posts and these kind of things. So as you can see, perhaps the common thread between these countries, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, China, is that the authorities, they have been active in supporting 5G deployments. So they did not approach 5G as a way of extracting money from the operators by means of an auction or by means of high spectrum fees. What they did was consider that 5G was a national priority, and deployment of 5G was a national priority. And then starting from there, they identified policies that would facilitate those deployments. And some of them are related to spectrum, like lower spectrum fees, delayed payments. Others are related to facilitating access to sites. Others are related to obligations as well. But on the target always remains the fact that they want to encourage 5G deployments rather than trying to get as much money as possible from the operators. Okay, so let's get into the final part of this session, which is looking at the future. What I'm showing you here are a couple of forecasts of traffic growth. So one comes from the ITU and the other comes from Ericsson. So these are just forecasts, just to be clear. Nobody's got a crystal ball. Nobody knows exactly what are going to be the numbers in terms of traffic per user. What is going to be 40 gigabytes per month or 250 gigabytes per month? We don't know, but what everybody agrees on is that the mobile broadband traffic is going to continue to grow. So the demand will continue to grow. So the question then is, how can we accommodate that demand, in particular when it comes to spectrum? And in that, before getting into that, just one element that I think is important in this discussion, and that is that in Africa as a whole and in South Africa, perhaps to a lower extent, but quite similar, the fact is that broadband access to the internet is through mobile devices, through mobile handsets, and through the mobile networks. So the coverage of the fixed broadband network is generally low in Africa. Less the case certainly in South Africa, but it's still low. So what that means is that most of users access the internet through their mobile phones and through the mobile networks. So from our perspective, this is an important thing to bear in mind. And we think that African authorities, South African authorities, should consider this when making the spectrum policy decisions, and should try to support this means of accessing the internet through mobile networks, and they should try to support that by ensuring that the mobile networks have access to sufficient spectrum to continue providing the service. So this, of course, should be in parallel with increasing the penetration in the households, no doubt about that. But that is going to take some time. And from our perspective, fixed wireless access is a very useful tool in that. But we should always remember that for now and for a foreseeable future, the means of accessing the internet is going to be through the mobile networks. Okay, so having said that, going back, let's go back to the question about what spectrum we should look at next. And from our perspective, the 6 gigahertz band, which is now on top of all the regulatory discussions. So this is a band that is very important that will be very important for mobile in the future. We think it has the good characteristics already. It is quite close to the C-band in terms of propagation and in terms of capacity. So there is ample capacity there. We are considering about 700 megahertz, 700 megahertz block in this band. And when it comes to coverage, it is much more like the C-band than like the millimeter waves. It's certainly a bit worse, in particular for indoor scenarios, but it is quite similar. So, and this is important because it means that it will be possible to deploy 6 gigahertz base stations at the same sites as the as the C-band sites, and provide a similar coverage. So from the purely regulatory perspective, the band is also interesting because it's already allocated to the mobile service on a primary basis. So the step towards IMT is not a big step, it's a relatively small step. The interest also comes from the economies of scale. So the band is supported by China, and China is very likely to open this band for mobile quite soon. There is the question of WRC. I'll come to that in a minute, but China certainly has this band in target as the next band for 5G. Other regions like Russia and the RCC region, which is the countries around Russia, they're also considering this band. There is wide support from the industry, from vendors and a majority of operators as well. And the works towards that has already started. We are doing tests in China, field tests for the technology, and for basically we're testing the propagation. So we're doing several tests there in China with the Chinese regulator. And then in parallel with those field tests, there is the work in ITU that we'll see in a minute. And our 3GPP, which is the standards body, is also working on this band, or at least has the band scheduled for the coming future. So as I said, the band is supported by the mobile industry. So most of vendors and many operators think that this band is going to be key for the future, as well as the GSMA, of course. And we are working together to make it a reality. So in terms of the time plan for that, what is very important here is the ITU process. So at the last conference, the last WRC conference in 2019, there was a proposal from the African countries to consider this band for IMT. So that means that in the next WRC in 2023, this band is going to be in the agenda. So for a possible IMT identification. So between 2019 and 2023, ITU is looking at the coexistence of IMT with incumbents. In this band, the incumbents are the uplinks of the fixed satellite service, and also the fixed service, so the fixed links. So the ITU groups are looking at that. They will start looking and doing the actual coexistence work in the second half of this year. And then in parallel with that work, as I mentioned, 3GPP is working on the standardization and the field tests, and various companies are working on the setting up the ecosystem for the band, with a target of seeing perhaps the first wave of deployments around 2024, when we will have the ITU, the WRC decision made, and then the equipment, the chipsets and the equipment will be ready. Okay, so that's all I want to say. Let me just conclude with a quick summary of our main messages. So the first perhaps is when it comes to 5G spectrum, highlight and emphasize the importance of the C-band, which is the most popular band, the best supported band in the handsets. And I would say there's consensus in the industry about this one being the key band for 5G. Second, the importance of large contiguous blocks. So to be able to provide the speeds that 5G is supposed to provide, but also to do that in a way that is cost efficient and spectrum efficient. Third, when looking at the licenses, first, the price of the licenses should be affordable, but also if we're thinking about obligations, which we think it's a reasonable thing to consider, those obligations should be proportional, should be agreed with the operators, and should be reasonable to first the goals that the authorities have, but also the realities of the country and the realities of the business of the operators. Specifically talking about bands in South Africa, our recommendations is to go, of course, to go ahead with the auction as soon as possible. And also when it comes to the existing bands, to make sure that the regulations do not preclude deployments of 5G. Then looking at future bands and additional capacity, we think that South Africa should consider the 3638, which is currently allocated for satellite services. We think it's an important block for 5G if the authorities consider that this is a more valuable way of using the spectrum. Also, the 4.8 to 5 gigahertz bands is something I didn't speak about, but it's also a band that can be used for additional capacity in the future. And then perhaps more finally to conclude, when thinking about the longer term, we certainly recommend the 6 gigahertz band for future 5G in the second part of this decade. And this is all I wanted to say. Thanks for listening. And now let me know if there is any question.
Thank you, Cesar. Thank you for that, all the valuable information and all of the stuff that you've shared around the importance of spectrum. I think it was an excellent session. I've got one question in the Q&A panel at this stage from Lyndon Petzer, who asks on slide 15, if you could please explain the concept of modules a little bit further.
Right. Okay. Yes. Sure. So what I mean here by module is a radio module. So basically, it would be the RF block that supports a given band. There the transmitter and the receiver block that supports a given band. So if you want to support two bands from the same site, you will need two radio modules, one for each band. So it is true that there are some some of the vendors we do have modules that support multiple bands, but not all band combinations are supported. So there is a good chance that if you have an operator with a spectrum in 2 different bands, it will have to deploy 2 different modules, 2 different physical radio units in that in the site.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I think that clarifies how it works and the importance of the modules. And obviously, this will can have a huge impact on cost as well. So, thank you for that. I don't have any other questions apart from will we share the slides? Yes, as with all the other sessions, I will share the slides with the Digital Council Africa, which will make them then available to all of you. If there's no more questions, Cesar, just from London's side, he says thank you for an excellent presentation and he's happy with your answer. From our side then, from Digital Council Africa, unfortunately, again, Juanita could not join us for today's session. And from Huawei, we thank you very much for your participation. And please remember that we've got another 2 sessions scheduled for one for Thursday and one for Friday, same time, same place. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Cesar, for your valued information. Stay warm and stay safe. If you're in South Africa, it's a bit chilly, and we hope to see you soon.